Hello and welcome to the EMJ Health Podcast with me, your host, Dr. Jonathan Sakia. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Jean Wright, Chief Executive Officer of the Chronic Obstructive Pulmonary Disease, or COPD Foundation. After graduating from the University of Michigan with her bachelor's degree and completing her medical degree at Wayne State University School of Medicine in Detroit, Michigan, she started her residency training in pediatrics at Emory University in Atlanta, a place I used to visit with some frequency. She was chief resident in pediatrics and then began a residency in anesthesia, also at Emory. She joined the faculty in 1983 as a pediatric anesthesiologist and intensivist and became board certified in pediatrics, Paediatric Critical Care, anesthesia, and Anaesthesia-Critical Care. In 1994, she received her MBA from the executive degree program at Emory's Goizueta Business School, and 4 years later was awarded an honorary Doctor of Divinity degree by Westminster College in Pennsylvania. Jean's work in predictive analytics and the use of innovation to drive change brought her into the world of chronic disease management. After 13 years serving as Chief Innovation Officer at Atrium Health, formerly known as the Carolinas Healthcare System, Jean's business acumen and leadership, coupled with her transformative approaches to healthcare delivery, led her to be appointed as CEO of the COPD Foundation back in December 2022. The COPD Foundation, as its name suggests, is a non-profit organization established to improve the lives of people living with COPD, bronchiectasis, and non-tuberculous mycobacterial lung disease. They drive initiatives that expand services and speed innovations to make treatment more effective and affordable. Jean has given testimony before the United States House and Senate, lucky girl, and has appeared on American TV shows like 2020, The O'Reilly Factor, CNN, and published over 50 articles. In 2000, she won the American College of Physicians Executive Physician of Excellence Award, and in 2017 received the Athena Award for Women in Leadership. Jean also has a TikTok account. I mean, I tell you, I could go on for hours about this amazing woman. She's also got a TikTok account called, wait for it, Horses for COPD, where she uses horses to raise awareness for COPD. So make sure to check that out, and we'll put that in the show notes. Welcome to the podcast, Dr. Jean Wright. It's an absolute pleasure to have you here. I'm astonished you've got the time to fit in talking to me.
Oh, well, thank you so much for hosting this. This is going to be a fun time together. I can tell that already. Thank you for the kind words. And as our guests may have already figured out, I'm not your typical pulmonologist, and I didn't have the typical path into COPD. As you mentioned, I'm a pediatric anesthesiologist and an intensivist. I revere and respect the lung. I put a lot of young patients on ECMO, but it was actually my research and health services that really caught my attention. And, you mentioned that I went to business school. I think they went in alphabetical order and said, you cross the street. And as you recall, the business school, the School of Medicine, the public health, the CDC are all on Clifton Road. And
Right.
It's a true brain trust there. But in business school, I often joke that I got my third eye because I learned informatics, which was 1992. So that was, when the internet sounded like, right, dialed it up.
I remember sitting there with my very first laptop and connecting via a modem and listening to
Yes.
those stupid noises. And I'm looking at, my very first website. And I thought, this is what all the fuss is about. It's a page of type. This is awful.
That's right.
This is never going to be a success.
Your screen, but my screen had orange letters. I can still remember that.
Oh, God.
But I began to see the future of informatics and analytics, what it could do in healthcare. And I took a formal class in innovation. And that may become important later in our dialogue. I had always thought innovation was, the happy, cheerful miscongeniality. They wore bright colors. They used Post-it notes. They always had the most fun sessions. But there's a real science to it. And there's a way that we can de-risk innovation. And there's a way that we can I have to say, be first, be fast, and skip unnecessary steps. So those two trainings really caused my career to pivot. And I ended up with a $16 million grant, and they said, pick any chronic disease and see if you can move the needle with informatics. Wow, that was like a kid in a candy store. And honestly, compared to writing the typical NIH grant, randomized controlled trial, it was in Obama's first administration, and he named 17 cities beacons because we were farther along in EMR integration and adoption. So I had 16 million. We picked COPD, and as they would say, the rest is history.
Wow, wow. And I mean, I guess if you pull back, and it's very often the case with in my experience of talking to people like you who stand out as being, highly, highly driven and highly transformative, that if you look back, you go, that was their cunning plan all along. I was talking yesterday to a chap who's an engineer and an orthopedic surgeon. And it's like you could see his journey. But he told me, oh, no, it's a complete accident. I had no bloody idea what I was doing one day to the next. Did you have did you have a vision that one day I'm going to head something like the COPD Foundation and try and affect change in that way rather than as a clinician?
Never. I really thought I would stay in pediatric healthcare forever. I used to say, I barely like adults as friends, much less as patients. I would rather, hang around children and dogs and now horses. But no, I could never see it. But as your colleague said, looking back, those moments, taking that analytic course, taking an opportunity in business school, I honestly think many of us thought the EMR would function much like a GPS on your car. That if you were a clinician and you were beginning to route out somebody's LAD, and that a sign would come up and say, warning, blockage ahead, turn to the right. Instead, what we got was a very complicated way of billing. Sorry to sound so cynical about that, but we didn't get those alerts at the right time, the just-in-time alerts. And I was just intrigued by that and thought, how can we get out ahead of things and make people aware? In fact, my first entree was, if somebody has an elevated creatinine, why don't we put a stop in the pharmacy so they can't order a generic
Gentamicin
antibiotic,
type drug.
right? Yeah, 3 blind mice, and that could damage the kidney all the further without doing a serious look at the creatinine and what it would do. Just a stop. And that's what GPS does for me all the time. 20 years later, 30 years later, I think we're about there. Now, you mentioned knowing something about the South. I'll throw in some Southern verbs. Fixin'. Fixin' means we're fixing to do this. So we're fixing to get these alerts in the right place at the right time. But we're not quite there yet. So we never know if fixing's a year or if it's 10 years or whatever. But I think we're quite close. And now that people are using EMRs to create registries, I right now, I'm working with a team up at Winston-Salem, which is about an hour and a half north of Charlotte. And we have a pretty good way using just the data of figuring out who probably has COPD without even asking them if they smoked, without even looking at spirometry, just looking at how their behavior
Yeah.
aligns with other people that look just like that.
I saw something recently, Gene, where utilizing sensors in the home, like with older people, you can, as I'm sure you well know, that sudden acute confusion in an old person, if it's not a stroke, it's a UTI. Those are the common things, right? And you can sometimes head that off because you can pick up that they're getting up more than they did in the middle of the night to have a pee.
Right.
So that's the kind of thing. Well, you've mentioned COPD. Let's get into COPD. And I think I told you this is of personal interest to me because my late dad had COPD. He was a smoker. The last few years of his life were utterly, utterly heartbreaking. The desperation of watching him trying to walk from a chair to the toilet and wheeling his oxygen behind him. And I used to think the bastards who made cigarettes and did this to my dad and all the whole family. It affected my mum, everyone. And yet it's often characterized as a smoker's disease. I always believed it was back in the day. And yes, 75% of COPD patients, have been smokers, but 25% haven't. So I know you're going to talk to us about alpha 1 antitrypsin, other causes. I told you that I used to live in Virginia. Talk a bit about your data analytics work looking at the prevalence of COPD along the gorgeous Appalachians in America. And to anyone listening who hasn't been to America, if they go to New York, they go to Orlando, they go to Miami, they go to LA. Put those aside. Go visit the Appalachians. That is true America, and it's beautiful.
Oh, thank you. Our travel bureau thanks you as well. You're right. It has been labeled as a smoker's disease, and smoking clearly is a trigger. It accelerates what all of us has as a normal aging pattern in our lungs. It makes that path, decel, go down, fall apart more rapidly. And just as you described your dad, if people saw what the last 2 or 3 or 5 years of their life is, they would be scared and they would want to avoid that at all. One of the reasons people don't see that is, first of all, that part of life is not on television, it's not in the movies. And when people get to that stage, they become hermits because they can't get out, because they can't pull that tank of oxygen with them. So they're not in the public. In fact, Leonard Nimoy was a smoker his entire life. And as I understand it, he late in life became a champion for COPD, but it was only after somebody saw him being wheeled in a wheelchair with oxygen through an airport, right? And he was outed there, and then people realized that he had it. There are other causes. You mentioned alpha 1 antitrypsin. In fact, I think Scotch, Irish, English people have a higher propensity. In fact, since many of you and us, my father is a Glaswegian and immigrated to the United States. And I think almost everybody in our family carries that gene. And many of those people settled in the Appalachian areas. So alpha 1 is there. But then when you look at other demographics, people who are firefighters, first responders, often say if you were fortunate enough to run into the towers at 9/11 and run back out, you ran back out with COPD because all the pollutions that were in the air, not only that day, but for days after that. We know there's occupational exposure. We know that women, for some reason, we seem to get the disease. Maybe that's not the right phrase. We demonstrate the disease earlier in life. We have a heavier burden of symptoms, even if we've had a lesser exposure to tobacco. So I'm glad that we're now thinking it as beyond just a smoker's disease. In fact, we have a marketing campaign that we have launched in minor league baseball stadiums. Why minor league? Because that's affordable for most Americans. And about 30 million people will go to a minor league baseball game. And in that video that we show during the not for profit charity moment, it says one in 8 of you will have COPD. It'll look down the aisle. Which one is it? And then another tagline is, if you breathe, you could have COPD. I'm very interested. In fact, you're probably going to put the reins on me and pull me back at some point. But I'm very interested in the work that's come out of Europe that looks at your lung life as a trajectory. Now, you mentioned I'm a pediatrician. Every time a kid came to the practice, we measured them, we weighed them, we saw where they were developmentally, and we plotted it. We have no such plot for lung disease, at least in the US, and at least that is being commonly applied. What if, like in the US, when you turn 65, you get a Medicare annual wellness exam, but there's no lung metrics. They do your hemoglobin A1C, they do your cholesterol, but nobody does something as simple as a peak flow, an FEV1, or an FVC. And yet, when you look at Bart Celli and Alvar Augusti's work out of Europe, they're showing really convincing diagrams that we should know. We, the individuals, not just a academicians or the researchers, you should know. I bet you know what your hemoglobin A1C is. I bet you know what your last blood pressure is. Because you're smarter than the average bear, you might know what your FEV1 is. But if you're like everybody else I know, oh, I just saw the eyes get big. So, truth be told, have you had pulmonary function testing or any kind of lung test?
Yeah, I did. I had. I'm a very fortunate to be a pretty fit guy, and I've flown aeroplanes for most of my life. But I had long COVID, and I suffered from a raft of symptoms. I became a believer in post-viral syndromes. I had dyspnea. If
Mm-hmm.
I bent over to do my shoes up, I was gasping for breath. I used to run 8 kilometers every day. I couldn't walk 80 meters, 80 yards
Wow.
without gasping for breath. And so I went to, there was a long COVID clinic run by a pulmonologist and infectious disease guy. And I said, how did you get into running this clinic? He said, because I have COVID, long COVID. And when I was reading out all the symptoms I had, and I said, I feel like such a fraud because I've never
Mhm.
been ill. And he said, let me tell you, every single symptom you've got, I've got. So I
Right.
went through a whole raft of pulmonary function tests, and you're absolutely right. It should be. Well, I'll tell you what. Let's cycle back because I asked you about the work that you did that identified the presence of this disease in the Appalachians, and you've already hinted at the association with the genetics of alpha one antitrypsin. What else did you discover that led you to point at the Appalachians as a hotbed, if you will, of COPD?
Um, there's coal mining. There's still coal mining. And in the rest of the world, there's the use of coal as still a cooking element. Now, we don't have that here in the US, but we do have the mining of it. We have rural life. I'm sitting out right now in a beautiful vineyard. But along with that comes fertilizers, comes dust, comes distance from healthcare. I would guess is probably 40 minutes to the closest hospital from here,
Yeah,
probably 30 minutes at least to the closest primary care. And so we know the farther away you get from the epicenters of academic medical care, how there's a fall off and just access to care. In the U.S., COPD pretty much lives in primary care, so internal medicine, family medicine, because with anywhere from 15 million diagnosed cases and maybe up to 30 million if you include those undiagnosed, that's where they're getting their care. They're not getting a pulmonologist. They're not going somewhere where there's spirometry in the office. I often say to people, if you could even just have your patients hold a birthday candle at arm's length and blow it out, if they can do that, they probably have an FEV1 or FEC that's adequate. At
yeah.
least you could take them off the list of the people that need to be screened. So back to your question about rural, and that's actually one of the things that led me to the horses, because I have a daughter who's an equestrian. So the dutiful mom spends a lot of hours driving to barns and talking to horses, right? Not really. I'm not quite that crazy. But we were looking for an animal that might be a good logo or spokesperson for COPD. And we thought, in the United States, we have an insurance company, Geico, that has the gecko. We have Aflac.
The English gecko, right?
Yes.
He's got a
Yeah.
Cockney accent.
Well, see, it raised his IQ, didn't it? It made us want to listen to him. So, I looked at different animals, and one day somebody at the barn said, "See that horse over there? It has COPD." I said, "How do you know that?" And they said, "There's a heave line." So, humans, when they have COPD, they purse their lips
To
and they
increase the
build up
pressure.
pressure within their chest. Horses do something similar. And when they do so, they get this line that's essentially a muscle on the side that's built up. And I said, but they don't smoke. How do they get COPD? And it's because they were made to eat green grass, and instead we feed them moldy hay. We put them in dusty environments, right? Um, so their exposure to their environmental concerns is the trigger. for them.
Wow.
And so I thought, who doesn't like a horse? So we've just been trying with different social media things. And I had started this about 5 or 6 years ago. In fact, my kids and I had tried to make something go viral, and we did a dance and that died. And, we tried to tag people a bit like the bucket challenge, and that didn't go anywhere. But the horses seem to get people's attention, and they can say things that if I got on, a little video and said it, people would go, "Oh, that's so boring." But if a horse says nutrition's important, in fact, New England Journal just had an article about how a plant-based diet, really helps patients with COPD and really prolongs their life. So if a horse says it, maybe people will listen to it. But
Fascinating. I'm going to dispute one thing I'm going to dispute one thing you said, that if you said something, people aren't going to listen. I think that's nonsense. Can we? You've hinted at diagnosing it. You mentioned some numbers: 30 million Americans with the condition. And by the way, that's more than the population of Australia, right? To give scale. With
right.
COPD, but only half are diagnosed. And you've already said that people don't routinely do lung function tests. Why only half of them diagnosed? And I'm sure it's multifactorial in the States.
Right, and I think it is everywhere.
Yeah.
One, we have not had a national spokesman for this disease, and I think you and I are probably going to talk about that later.
Mm.
Even though Leonard Nimoy began to become a spokesman, unfortunately, um, he passed before that message could really get out. So we don't have a Michael J. Fox. We don't have a readily identifiable face. I would say that's one reason. Number two, when people start getting the symptoms, they get tired. Well, who doesn't get tired? And so people dismiss that. I have a little TED talk out there, and I mentioned in the talk my Aunt Bernice. And Aunt Bernice worked at a factory. She never smoked, but she lived with a smoker for 60 years. She worked in a textile plant where she was, breathing in dust, but she walked 4 to 5 miles a day, every day on her lunch break. Then she retired. And she retired like at 80. So it's not like at 40, at 80. And her walking decreased because she wasn't doing that at work. And so she called me one day with her very sweet Southern accent, and she said, "Jean Ann, I can't make it out to the mailbox." And I'm thinking, what's going on? I was wondering if it was her hip or this or that. She was short of breath, just like you described. So I dutifully wrote a note to her doctor. I said, "I'm in the family, blah, blah, blah. Please test her for COPD." And he wrote me back and he said, "Good news, she doesn't have it. She never smoked. Thank you." That was a whole letter. He never took into consideration alpha 1, which I found out as I got into this work. I'm actually a carrier of it, as are my cousins. He never asked her about living with a smoker. He never asked her about exercise. And so I think it's right there. I also think it's right there in hiding behind heart failure.
Yeah.
And heart failure's had a lot of attention, and it's hard to tease apart. So probably too geeky of an answer, but now that we're getting smarter about it, now that we've got systems really looking for these patients, I think there's hope. And hopefully, when they watch the TikTok, in fact, this fall we're going to have a billboard on Times Square, thanks to one of our generous sponsors. So we're trying to get the word out in lots of different ways.
So you've already hinted at the need to make spirometry more ubiquitous. And the story you tell, by and way, the TED talk is great. We'll put a link to that in the show notes. I watched it, and you're a natural. And if you ever get tired of this advocacy and medical innovation research, there's a space for you doing stand up, Gene. I can tell you.
You're not the first person to say that, and you're probably not the first person that wishes I would move into it right away.
Well, I don't wish you would move into it. This is a blast for me, and again, given my personal connection to it, and a couple of other questions I've got lined up for you, but you've hinted at the need for the ubiquity of spirometry. So let's say we diagnose it earlier. What can we do? We can tell people, yeah, you can improve your diet, you can lose weight, you can do this. What can we do for people if we diagnose it earlier?
I'm glad you asked that. The At least the U.S. has been hamstrung by a recommendation that says screening for COPD is not effective. We call it the United States Preventative Services Task Force.
Oh,
In
don't
fact,
get me
they gave us
started
the
on them.
grade of D, like a letter D. I mean, I can't imagine any of us who are pre-meds who ever had a D. But as a result, folks have been reluctant to get into this. This is why, if we could shift over to thinking about a metric over life, right? Similarly, if we could think about where in the disease path is there a step that could either be stopped, like statins have stopped the progression for heart disease, or better yet, even reverse it. Right now, the medications that we use, bronchodilators, inhaled steroids, that's too little too late. That's not a statin. It would be like saying, oh, you have advanced heart disease. We give you nitroglycerin for that. Oh, your buddy over here has early heart disease and only has a 30% blockage. Let's put him on nitroglycerin. The logic doesn't work. And in fact, most of the medications that have been used in COPD came from the asthma world. Asthma is a reactive lung disease where the musculature clamps down and releases. That's not what's going on in COPD. So we have, begged, borrowed, and stealed from another disease, and we have not put our nose to the grindstone to really figure out the disease pathway, the pathophysiology. My colleague, Bruce Miller, who's our chief scientific officer, and I were at the NIH, particularly we were at the NHLBI recently. And James Kiley, who heads the pulmonary section, in fact, he's headed it since 1984. He knows everything in this field. He looked at us straight in the eye and said, we would invest if we knew what to invest in, but we still don't know where is that. And I just keep using the illustration of statin. There's a beautiful diagram now of how cholesterol is formed. And if you kind of back up the ladder of steps, you can see where statins interrupts. We need that for COPD. So, if you were concerned because you saw your dad and you said, I'm going to go and get tested, and they showed you that you were at an earlier stage, those medications that are out there are not really effective
So
for that
what's
early.
holding up developing them? Is it a shortage of investment in research? Because this is a massive opportunity for...
I didn't pay you to say that, but that is a perfect question. That's a home run question. So, and I don't know what you call a home run in cricket, and I still can't figure out that game.
No one can figure
Yeah.
out cricket, my dear.
Yes, we are behind in research. We're the third most common chronic disease as measured by the NIH, but we are 176 in funding. So here we have a disease that impacts so many people, and yet we are way down on the totem pole in terms of funding. Our country funds when Americans bang the doors of their congressmen, the congressmen write it into legislation, and it goes to the NIH. So without that grassroots movement, it's hard to do it. Secondly, the FDA only approves new drugs if it changes mortality, your lung function, or the number of times you get admitted to the hospital. Well, if you want an early drug, it's not going to show those metrics. In fact, we have some sessions coming up this fall with the NIH and the FDA to see if we can break through this. Most of us wear some sort of digital device, right? What if that change in steps? What if your pulse oximetry? What if your ability to, walk X distance in this amount of time? A digital metric was accepted. We also know that there's some biometrics that are out there. The COPD Gene Project has shown us a lot of proteomic markers. So that's what's holding up, is that we don't have a public hue and cry. We don't have the funding. And then we have metrics that only measure end-stage disease.
Yeah. And of course, this might be presumptive on my part, but it is a disease of older people, or is perceived to be. It is a disease that is found in rural communities. It is a disease that's found in smokers. it is a disease that's found in legacy industries like mining. And I'm just surprised because it is such a massive disease, and everything you say is bang on target. I mean, if you look at the funding for breast cancer research compared to prostate cancer research, prostate cancer is a very, very, very common disease. Why isn't there as much and many advances in prostate cancer as there are in breast cancer? Simple. Women are verbal and organized, and men, we just grunt basically. And there's little advocacy. There's people like Michael Milken,
Right.
who've been successful in raising the profile. But you're absolutely right. I I think this is a conversation you and I need to continue,
Yeah.
possibly with the produce of the vineyard that you're sitting in, and we can have a longer conversation about it. But
Right. I
Gene,
will add, I think this vaping epidemic
well,
is,
I want to come on to that. I want to come on to that. So I wanted to ask you. My father was a smoker. I can't stand the smell of cigarette smoke. But cigars sometimes kind of smelled okay, but I know they're dangerous. But vaping, oh my god, the sickly sweet smell, and people with surrounded by number one, I think they look bloody ridiculous. The smell is obnoxious as hell, and I've tried talking to my son about it and his friends, and they think it's okay. I think,
right.
I mean, just from first principles, you're putting organic compounds into your lungs. That can't be okay. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I would agree with you. Unfortunately, the epidemic has really just been around since 2015. Hard to tell. We do know that that lung injury that came from vaping was related to one of those oily compounds that people inhaled. Is it a helpful tool in a bridge to getting people off of cigarettes? Maybe, but when you look at the people that are adopting it as a habit, I mean, I think they're adopting it as an anxiolytic so that they don't have to go to behavioral health and they can get a hit of nicotine. And, honestly, I would say if somebody needs a hit of nicotine, go to something like those sublingual patches. But inhaling, you're exactly right. Anything other than air can't possibly be good for you.
Yeah.
But I hope we can use it as a way to at least get that conversation started.
Well, I don't know if you've seen the news that in Britain there's been a move in Parliament to effectively ban smoking by making it illegal to buy cigarettes if you're not born, blah, 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 over a period of time. They want to try and phase cigarettes out. And,
Excellent.
I used to. I love going to a jazz club in London, and I remember going there in the old days and how obnoxious it was. It's just lovely. It's just lovely. So anyway, exercise capacity. I want to come back to that. I've mentioned long COVID, um, and in me it was dramatically reduced. And I got investigated for pulmonary function, cardiovascular issues. But there's also peripheral skeletal muscle impairment, and it's now thought to be due to compromised mitochondrial function, I believe. We also know
Correct.
that there are other countless viruses out there just itching to jump species. I know that I'm changing topics a little bit, but how do we try and stay ahead of the game and actually become a healthcare community rather than a reactive disease care community?
Oh my goodness. I think that's a sci-fi movie. I don't think we're going to see that in our lifetime. Um, I do think you're spot on about the mitochondria because when I first tried to figure out how does pulmonary rehab work, I'm thinking you're not stretching the lungs, you're exercising people overall. And what you're doing in that is you're making the mitochondria multiply. They actually move to the edge so they can be closer to the gas exchange. I can imagine if mitochondria talk, they're like, pick me, here's some CO2, pick me, right? And they're doing
So
that.
that's what pulmonary rehab does.
That's what pulmonary rehab does. Right. And that's why just a little exercise is not necessarily true pulmonary rehab. In fact, the purists would say, you know, like spirometry, You need a face-to-face interaction. I think nowadays there's a lot of ways we can do that virtually, just saying. You need to exercise to a certain degree where endurance is built. This weekend, I'm actually showing a horse for the first time to do a mother-daughter thing. And my daughter said to me the other day, Mama, I always thought of you as fit. You're kind of challenged, riding this horse and riding it English. I said, I wouldn't say I'm fit, but I have endurance, because the exercise that I focused on, over time has been so that I could walk a long distance, so that I could lift weights, those sorts of things. I don't want a hip fracture. But no, I don't think of your mama as fit like that. But you're exactly right. And honestly, I'm going to give you a prize and a gold star, because you're the only person I have talked to, other than our pulmonary physiologists, who know that or appreciate that. Now, in the US, every high school biology student learns this phrase: the mitochondria is, and what's the rest of the sentence? Do you have that in the UK?
Oh, that, the cell's battery or some such thing.
The
The
powerhouse of the
powerhouse,
cell,
yeah.
right? And no great surprise that the powerhouse would be where that limitation of oxygen, really really hits. And so when people, my good friend at work has COVID this week. She's had it several times, and she said, I am so tired. Well, she exercises, right? But her mitochondria, right, are shut down right now. They are not functioning correctly.
Yeah, yeah. Fascinating. You did mention, Gene, that women have twice the burden. Um, and I remember a friend of mine, Sarah Lynn Mark, who does a lot on sex and gender medicine. She had a book that came out that was all about. She worked for NASA for a period of time,
Hmm.
and made the point that women would actually make better astronauts than men from a physiologic perspective. There were a number of reasons: skeletal muscle loss, issues with the back. Your back extends, so you get lumbar disc prolapse. But she was going to call when she first told me the title of the book, she was going to call it "Sex in Space," and I said, "You will sell 10 million copies." Well, she ended up calling it Stellar Medicine. Opportunity lost, methinks. No,
Uh,
but
uh,
brilliant woman.
right.
But she made the point to me. She taught me a lot about the differences. Why we need to think about men and women differently. We are physiologically and anatomically different creatures.
Yes.
Why do
Down
women
to every cell.
in every
Down to
cell? Right. I in
right.
fact tell people that I had a male dog, and I said I'm numerically, genetically closer to my dog than I am to any woman in my life. um, XY, XY, XXXX. Um,
Yes.
Tell us about disease burden in women in COPD. Why is it twice as high?
Um, I think there's a couple of reasons. One, most of us, unless we play professional basketball, are shorter than men. So remember that earlier conversation about those natural life curves? We start off with a smaller lung, chest capacity. And so the natural loss of lung volume that comes with aging, that's going to impact us most. And then if we added on smoking, and I'm the generation of women in America that were marketed to, there were commercials that said,
Yeah,
"You've
yeah,
come a long way, baby," and it socially was very, very prominent. But I think it's that loss of lung volume, and then it's or the lesser lung volume to begin with, and then the second thing is when the symptoms really do start to um, present is also when menopause presents, and andropause for that matter. So we're losing hormones that have been modulating every cell in our body. What's the role that they play? So a couple of months ago, I was with Dr. Dawn DeMeo. She is an investigator and focuses her career on chronic lung disease and gender. And so she's helping us work through a project about that very topic. And she's our lead investigator on the COPD gene project, looking at the women's aspect of it. But I think we just used to always think it's, in my med school, they would always say, we're going to base all of our calculations on the ideal 70 kilogram man. Well, I've been single my whole life, and I've been looking for him, and I haven't. But women and our biology does not follow that path. So I think there's a lot to be uncovered there, and I'm grateful for the research. We think in the U.S. that Jill Biden and her initiative in women's health will draw some attention to that as well. But
Yeah.
we're way overdue in that one.
Yeah, very much so. So also want to circle back to something you said when you mentioned Leonard Nimoy, who I was a huge fan of. I thought he was a fascinating man. Yeah, I can't do it. I can't. Well, sort
Can't
of.
do the hand signal.
I
Yeah.
sort of. I loved it. Vulcan mind mailed. Loved it. So, and I'm a big fan of prominent people speaking about disease awareness to erode stigma, encourage research investment, educate disease testing, treatment. And I've personally developed and run several campaigns with people like Larry King, Sir Roger Moore, bless him, and many others. And we know that people in America, like Johnny Carson, who may not be known to many British people, but he ran a late night TV show. He was like our Michael Parkinson. Dean Martin, Christy Turlington, Leonard Bernstein, and as you said, Leonard Nimoy had COPD. Where is the celebrity awareness campaign for this? And you made the point, it's a very good point. When they get it, people don't go out. But in the work that I've done with celebrities, in fact, a mate of mine, John Oates, who's been a very successful musician for many, many years, has been, he was recently talking to me about his shoulder surgery for rotator cuff. He recently did a single to raise awareness about teen cancer.
Hmm.
I have found that people in that community, contrary to the way that they're portrayed in the press, tend to be the nicest, warmest, most engaged, most committed people. Why the heck hasn't one come forward, or why haven't you found one?
I don't know. It's not for lack of trying. We have tried. I was kidding with our marketing team the other day. I said, I think I'm going to take an ad out in Variety or Entertainment or some, you know, journal piece that they would look at and say, you know, we're looking for you. Maybe I should go to a casting company and see if we could cast somebody and says must have COPD to, you know, to be in this part of the play. But um, we think stigma has been a big part. We think actually the shame that their friends and family have given them, because a lot have said, you did this to yourself. Um, there is one woman was in the military and she got it from burn pits, and she's probably 45 to 50. She's very effective.
Yeah, sure.
And when we put somebody out there that's not gotten it from smoking, that seems to be a good way.
Yeah. Well, it's a
Yeah.
great point, but I'm going to put my thinking cap on for sure and see if I can't hook you up with some people. Finally, because we're running out of time, which I'm desperately sad about because I think I could go on all afternoon. A question that I ask every guest that comes on here: if you came across a magic genie when you're out walking through the vineyards who could grant you three wishes in your area of healthcare, what might those wishes be?
Okay, I won't include the ideal 70-kilogram man. I would start with having lung metrics as a measure of life. And interestingly, I wouldn't have said this a year ago, but you know what gets measured, people take action about. Can you imagine if you went to the grocery store and right next to that blood pressure cuff was a place for you, even if you just did the screening questionnaire? Those are highly effective. Then you could take a screenshot of it and take it to your doctor and say, I didn't do very well in this screening thing, and it says I should talk to you. So, some way to get that idea of there's a metric for my lung, I should know what it is. I think number two would be funding, because as you mentioned, this is a disease, and I like the other elements you brought in. Who goes to bat after the coal miners? Who goes to bat after some of these legacy issues? I remember in business school, when my professor said he used to study coal miners and do his research on it, and then he shifted to studying CEOs because there was a lot more money there, right? Who gets in line to help them? Who goes to bat for rural America? Now, there are some groups that do that. And when you look at a map almost of any country, in fact, you mentioned Australia the other day, I saw that 50% of Australians live in like 7 cities around the perimeter, and then, the rest is rural. So I think being able to recognize those people in rural locations to get access to them, I'd want to do something in that. If in America, if we can show that there is a market and a way to stop a disease, pharma will move in. We're a market-driven economy,
Yes.
which is great on some things, but on healthcare, it means pharma only follows where there's going to be money.
And frankly, Gene, in this environment where the centrally funded healthcare, by the way, I hate the term socialized medicine. It drives me up the bloody wall. It's basically a single payer system, which has got flaws. But if something shows economic benefit, there's actually pharma companies can actually do very well over here because of the QALY system, quality adjusted life years. And for COPD, God, my poor dad was in and out of hospital so many times, and home oxygen and multiple drugs and multiple chest infections. It was a bloody nightmare. So all I can say is I hope your wishes get granted.
You gave me a great example there that I'm going to take away, because I do think one of those metrics for the role of intervening early with the right medications at the right time is that quality of adjusted life. And I think that should be a metric that we
Pharma,
introduce.
if a pharmaceutical researcher or CEO is listening in, go have a look at how sales of the GLP-1 drugs are doing, because you could be looking at the next GLP-1 drug, because there's that many people living with this wretched condition. I'm afraid that's all we've got time for today. I want to encourage everyone to watch Gene's October 2020 TEDx talk, which we will put in the show notes. It's called The Invisible Epidemic of COPD, and it's damn good. It really is. And she is, as you've seen, she's eminently watchable and listening to. And I'd really like to thank you, Gene, for being with us today and for doing what you're doing for patients living with COPD, even if they don't know it. It's been a real pleasure chatting with you.
You too. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome. You're so sweet. So, by the way, I've recently discovered if you do that on some of the VoIP platforms, hearts flow up. It's fantastic.
Oh, really?
I've been having lots of fun and doing it inappropriately when I'm on with pals of mine. So, folks, please subscribe to the MG podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you get your podcasts. And that way you won't miss an episode. Like us on social media, write a review, tell your friends, all the usual stuff. And check out the archives, because there's bags and bags of great episodes with people almost as fascinating as Gene. And please join us next week for another great guest. Until then, I'm Jonathan Sacchi. I want to thank you for listening to the MG Health Podcast. Please stay safe, stay well, stay curious. Bye for now.